Not every crime can be solved. Some leave behind questions that no detective, no forensic expert, and no logical explanation can ever answer. A locked room, a missing victim, a body that defies science itself. These are the crime scenes that defy reason. The cases that remain open forever. Tonight, we step into the darkness of real-life mysteries. Bizarre, terrifying, and impossible to explain. A murder where no killer could have escaped. A severed foot that washed ashore without a body. A woman whose very presence turned lethal. These are not just stories. They are real. And to this day, no one truly knows the truth. Welcome to the strangest crime scene clues ever discovered. But be warned, some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Silent Room, the impossible murder of Isidor Fink, New York City, 1929. The world was still reeling from the economic collapse, but for Isidor Fink, a Polish immigrant running a humble laundry business, survival was all that mattered. He was known to be obsessively cautious. His apartment door was always locked from the inside, and he never let strangers in. On the night of March 9th, a neighbor heard chilling screams coming from his small, dimly lit apartment. It was a violent, desperate sound, the kind that sends ice down your spine. Panicked, she ran to the nearest officer on patrol, and within minutes, the police arrived at Fink's apartment. But the moment they reached his door, the case took a bizarre turn. His door was bolted from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbances. The only way in was through the tightly shut door, which was locked from within. The police had to break a small window to reach the latch and force their way inside. What they found was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Fink was lying on the floor, his white shirt soaked in blood, 3 bullet wounds riddling his chest. His body was limp, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Yet there was no gun, no weapon, no sign of an intruder. The room was eerily untouched. No struggle, no theft, nothing out of place except the growing pool of blood seeping into the wooden floor. The investigators were baffled. If it had been a suicide, there should have been a gun. If it had been a murder, how did the killer escape? The only openings in the room were the small windows, but they were too tiny for an adult to squeeze through. The police interviewed neighbors, searched for hidden doors, even considered secret compartments. Nothing. The case was impossible, like a ghost had entered, fired 3 shots, and vanished into the ether. Detectives combed through Fink's life, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to kill him. But he had no known enemies. He worked long hours at his laundry shop and barely interacted with anyone outside of business. There were no signs of a robbery. His money was still in the apartment, undisturbed. The murder made no sense. Then another strange detail surfaced. The bullets in Fink's chest were fired at close range. Someone had stood just inches from him, aimed directly at his heart, and pulled the trigger. But no one could explain how the killer got into a room that was locked from the inside. Time passed, and theories emerged. Some suggested Fink knew his killer and let them in, but that was quickly dismissed. His paranoia was well documented, and he would never have allowed anyone inside willingly. Others proposed that the murderer shot him through the small window, but ballistics proved the angles wouldn't match. The police were left with an unanswerable riddle. A man was shot dead in a locked room, and there was no possible way for the killer to have entered or escaped. The newspapers called it the perfect crime. Psychics and spiritualists claimed a supernatural force had taken him, whispering of an entity that could walk through walls. But the police refused to accept that answer. They continued searching for logical explanations, yet none came. Months passed. The case went cold. The apartment sat empty, its walls still stained with the faint traces of Fink's last moments. But then, whispers began, stories from the tenants who moved in afterward. One tenant, a man named George Wallace, moved into the apartment 2 years later. He lasted 3 weeks. At first, everything seemed fine. But then, small things started happening. The door would lock itself, objects would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. Then came the sounds, soft whispers in the dead of night, the faint rustling of movement when no one was there. One night, Wallace woke up to a suffocating weight on his chest. He opened his eyes and swore he saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. He turned on the light, and the figure was gone. But the next morning, he found something chilling. 3 small holes in the wooden floor. Bullet holes, right where Fink had died. Wallace moved out the next day. Over the years, more tenants reported eerie occurrences. The sound of faint, desperate breathing. The sensation of being watched. The door locking itself, just as it had been on the night of the murder. Some believed Fink's spirit was trapped there, forever reliving his final moments, searching for justice in a crime that was never solved. Decades later, the legend of the silent room endures. A crime scene that defied reason. A murder that seemed impossible. A killer who was never seen. The case remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in history. To this day, no one knows how Isidor Fink died, or what truly happened in that locked room on March 9, 1929. The man in the chimney. The grisly fate of Joshua Maddux. The town of Woodland Park, Colorado, was a quiet, peaceful place. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew their neighbors, and where crime was almost unheard of. That was why, when 18-year-old Joshua Maddux went missing in 2008, it sent a ripple of unease through the community. Josh was a free spirit, known for his love of music, writing, and adventure. He often took long walks alone, exploring the forests that surrounded the town. So, when he didn't come home one evening, his family wasn't immediately alarmed. They thought he might have decided to camp out in the woods, enjoying the solitude. Days passed, then weeks. There was no sign of him. His family searched everywhere. The police combed through the woods, checked with friends, even explored the idea that he might have run away. But there was no evidence, no clues, no leads, nothing to suggest where he had gone. Years passed. Joshua Maddux became another missing person, another name added to the growing list of unsolved disappearances. His family never stopped looking, but hope faded with time. The town moved on. Life continued. Then, 7 years later, in 2015, something horrifying was discovered. A local man named Chuck Murphy had purchased an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It had once belonged to his family, but it had been vacant for years, left to rot among the trees. He had decided to tear it down, clearing the land to make way for something new. As workers began demolishing the structure, they made a grisly discovery. Inside the chimney, wedged tightly in a fetal position, was the mummified body of a young man. His knees were tucked against his chest, his arms folded inward. He had been there for years. The body was later identified as Joshua Maddux. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. People had given up on ever finding out what happened to him, but now they had an answer, though it only raised more questions. How had he gotten there? The cabin had been locked and abandoned for years. The chimney was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. There was no ladder, no way to climb up from the inside. The flue had been blocked off by a heavy metal grate. The condition of his body suggested no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no bullet wounds, no indication of foul play. The coroner concluded that he had died of dehydration and hypothermia. The official theory? He had climbed into the chimney head first, possibly as a prank or an attempt to enter the cabin, and become stuck. He had died slowly, unable to free himself. But many people, including his family, found this explanation difficult to believe. For one, Joshua was an intelligent and experienced outdoorsman. He would have known better than to try entering a chimney from the top, especially one as small and dangerous as that. Second, the metal grate at the bottom of the chimney would have made it impossible for him to have slid down naturally. It was rusted and immovable, meaning someone would have had to place it there after he was already inside. Then there was the most unsettling detail of all, the positioning of his body. He wasn't simply stuck in the chimney. He was wedged in, folded tightly, in a way that suggested force. It was not the position of someone who had simply fallen in. Some locals whispered about something more sinister. They remembered another man, Andy Newman, who had lived in Woodland Park around the same time. A drifter, known for his unsettling behavior and violent tendencies, he had bragged about killing someone and stuffing them in a hole. No one took him seriously at the time, but after Joshua's body was discovered, the rumors resurfaced. Andy had since moved away and later died in prison for another crime. If he had been involved in Joshua's death, the truth had died with him. Others believed something even darker lurked in the cabin. It had always had an eerie reputation. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed to have seen strange figures in the windows at night, shadows that moved when no one was there. The idea that Joshua had climbed in willingly seemed less and less likely the more people thought about it. In the end, there were no answers. The case remains an open mystery. Joshua's death was officially ruled accidental, but those who knew him refused to believe it. The cabin has since been demolished. The land is empty now, but people still avoid it. Some say that on quiet nights, you can hear something in the trees, a soft, scratching sound, like fingers dragging against stone. The ghost of a boy who never came home. The vanishing feet. The mystery of the severed limbs. It started in 2007. A lone beachcomber was walking along the shores of British Columbia, Canada, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the ocean air. The waves rolled in calmly, the sun glinting off the water, when something strange caught their eye. A shoe. A single sneaker, half buried in the wet sand. Curious, they stepped closer and nudged it with their foot. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just an abandoned shoe left behind by a careless traveler. It was heavier than it should have been. With a slow, creeping horror, they bent down, reached for the laces, and pulled. Inside the shoe was a human foot. A severed foot. The sight sent a shockwave through the small community. The authorities were called, the shoe was bagged, and an investigation was launched. But there was no immediate explanation. No recent reports of missing persons that matched the discovery. No shipwrecks, no plane crashes. Nothing to suggest where the foot had come from, or why it had washed ashore. Then, 6 months later, another one appeared. This time it was a different beach. Another sneaker, another severed foot, and then another, and another. Over the next few years the feet kept coming. Always the same pattern. A single sneaker washed up along the coast, still containing the remains of a foot. By 2019, at least 21 separate feet had been found. And no one knew why. Theories exploded. Some believed it was the work of a serial killer, someone methodically cutting off feet and dumping them into the ocean, knowing that the currents would carry them far away. Others suspected an international crime syndicate, human traffickers disposing of their victims in the most gruesome way possible. Some even whispered of something supernatural, an ancient curse, an angry sea god demanding tribute. The police, however, had a different explanation. According to forensic analysis, many of the feet were identified as belonging to missing persons who had drowned. When a body is lost at sea, it decomposes, and the natural currents eventually break it apart. The reason why only feet were washing up, they explained, had to do with the buoyancy of modern sneakers. The lightweight foam and rubber kept the feet afloat while the rest of the body sank. It seemed logical, a neat scientific explanation that made the grisly mystery feel a little less terrifying. But there were problems. Many of the severed feet showed no signs of having been forcibly detached. They were not cut, not torn violently. Instead, they had separated cleanly at the ankle, as if something or someone had carefully removed them. The smoothness of the break disturbed forensic experts.
as it did not match the usual way bodies break down in the ocean. Then there was the disturbing fact that the feet kept appearing in only one area, the coast of British Columbia and Washington State. If this was simply a case of natural decomposition, why were no other body parts ever found? No hands, no torsos, no skulls, just feet, and only in sneakers. It was almost as if something wanted them to be found. Investigators looked into the possibility of a mass disaster, a sunken ship, a plane crash, a forgotten tragedy that could explain the sheer number of human remains. But nothing matched. None of the recovered feet belonged to the same person. There was no logical connection between them, no way to explain why they were surfacing one at a time over the course of years. Eventually, some of the feet were linked to known missing persons cases. Hikers who had vanished in the wilderness, drowning victims, and even individuals known to have died by suicide. This only deepened the mystery. Their bodies had never been found, yet somehow their feet had. But there were still some feet that remained unidentified. Who did they belong to? The pattern was impossible to ignore. The tide would go silent for months, sometimes years. Then, without warning, another foot would appear. The fear never really faded. The beaches, once a place of relaxation, became a hunting ground for grim discoveries. People no longer strolled along the shore without glancing down, half expecting to see another shoe sticking out of the sand. And the question remained, was it truly an accident of nature, or was something lurking beneath the waves waiting to claim its next victim? No one knows for sure. The feet still wash ashore.
The Dyatlov Pass Incident. The hikers who died without explanation. In the dead of winter, deep in the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains, 9 experienced hikers set out on what should have been an ordinary expedition. It was January 1959, and the group, led by Igor Dyatlov, was young, strong, and well-trained. They had faced harsh conditions before. This was just another challenge, one they were prepared for. But something went terribly wrong. Weeks later, when their bodies were finally found, the horror of what had happened left even the most hardened investigators speechless. The search team had been dispatched after the hikers failed to return on schedule. They expected to find a simple accident, perhaps an avalanche, a misstep on the icy cliffs. What they discovered instead was something out of a nightmare. The first thing they found was the campsite. The hikers' tent was still there, pitched on a snowy slope, but it had been ripped open from the inside, as if they had been trying to escape something in a blind panic. Their belongings were still inside, clothes, shoes, food, all untouched. But there was no sign of the hikers themselves. Then they found the bodies. They were scattered in the snow, some nearly a mile from the campsite. But the way they had died made no sense. 2 were found near a burned-out fire, dressed only in their underwear, with no shoes, as if they had fled in terror. Their hands were raw, stripped to the bone, as though they had tried to claw their way up a tree. Others were found lying face down in the snow, seemingly having frozen to death. But the strangest bodies of all were found in a ravine, buried beneath feet of snow. Their injuries were horrific. One hiker's skull had been crushed, as though it had been struck by an inhuman force. 2 others had multiple broken ribs, their chests caved in, not injuries caused by an avalanche, but something far more violent. Strangest of all, one of the female hikers was missing her tongue and eyes, yet there were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts. The bodies had been crushed from the inside, as if by an invisible force. The coroner later compared the damage to that of a car crash, but there was no sign of a collision, no tracks, no evidence of anything that could explain it. The theories exploded. The Soviet government quickly classified the case, fueling speculation that the hikers had seen something they were never meant to see, perhaps a secret military test, a weapon so deadly that it left no trace. Some even whispered about radioactive exposure, as some of the hikers' clothes were found to be contaminated with radiation. But that only deepened the mystery. Where would they have encountered such a thing? Then there were the stranger theories. Some believed the group had been attacked by a creature, something unknown, something beyond human understanding. There were whispers of the Mansi people's legends, of a beast that roamed the Ural Mountains, hunting those who dared enter its territory. But no footprints, no signs of an attacker were ever found. Others suggested infrasound, a phenomenon where powerful winds create vibrations so low they trigger deep, primal fear. Could the hikers have been driven mad by an unseen force? Could they have fled their tent, tearing through the fabric in panic, only to die in the freezing wilderness? Then there were those who thought it was something worse. The night before the incident, other hikers in the region reported seeing strange lights in the sky, orbs of glowing, pulsating light, moving in unnatural patterns. Could the Dyatlov group have witnessed something they weren't meant to? Could they have encountered something from beyond this world? The Soviet authorities quickly shut down any further speculation. The case was closed with an unsatisfying conclusion. The hikers died due to an unknown compelling force. For decades, the mystery endured. Researchers, scientists, and conspiracy theorists all tried to piece together what had happened, but no explanation fully accounted for the terror that must have unfolded that night. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case. They attempted to put it to rest, concluding that an avalanche was the most likely cause. But even that didn't fully explain the missing eyes, the missing tongue, the crushed bones without external injuries. The Dyatlov Pass remains an eerie, desolate place. Hikers who venture there speak of an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something unseen still lingers in the air. No one truly knows what happened that night. No one ever will. The toxic woman, the death of Gloria Ramirez. On the night of February 19, 1994, a woman named Gloria Ramirez was rushed into the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital in California. She was dying, her body failing, her breathing erratic. The medical staff sprang into action, preparing to stabilize her. It should have been a routine, if tragic, case. But within minutes, the room became the setting of one of the strangest medical mysteries in history. Because Gloria Ramirez was toxic. The moment the doctors and nurses began working on her, something unthinkable happened. One by one, the staff began collapsing. It started with the nurse drawing Gloria's blood. The second the syringe was pulled from her arm, a strong, chemical odor filled the air. It smelled like ammonia, sharp and pungent. The nurse's head spun. She felt weak. Moments later, she collapsed to the floor. Another nurse stepped in, trying to help, but she suddenly felt her limbs go numb. Her skin prickled as an icy wave of dizziness overtook her. She, too, collapsed. Then a third. A doctor standing nearby staggered backward, clutching his chest, his vision blurring. The hospital was in chaos. Staff fled the room, gasping for air, leaving Gloria Ramirez lying there, dying, her body exuding something no one could explain. Within minutes, 23 people had fallen ill. 5 were hospitalized, including one nurse who remained in the ICU for 2 weeks. But what was happening? What had turned this dying woman into a biological weapon? Despite the panic, the remaining doctors managed to stabilize her long enough to try and save her life. But it was too late. At 8:50 p.m., Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead, and that should have been the end of it. But it was only the beginning, because the moment her body was moved to the morgue, the mystery deepened. Even in death, she was dangerous. The autopsy could not be conducted under normal circumstances. Medical examiners were forced to wear full hazmat suits, treating her body like radioactive material. Every time they tried to handle her, the strange symptoms returned. The chemical smell lingered, making anyone who got too close feel weak, nauseous, and lightheaded. The media soon caught wind of the case. The toxic lady, as she was dubbed, became the subject of wild speculation. Was she the victim of a bizarre poisoning? Had she been exposed to a deadly chemical? Or was something far more sinister at play? Theories emerged, each one more disturbing than the last. Some believed she had been exposed to nerve gas, possibly as part of a secret government experiment. Others suggested she had been murdered with a rare poison, one that reacted with her bloodstream in a way never seen before. But then, an even more terrifying theory surfaced, one that seemed almost impossible. Could Gloria Ramirez have produced a deadly chemical inside her own body? Some researchers believed that Ramirez, who had been diagnosed with cervical cancer, might have been taking dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, a common home remedy for pain. Normally harmless, DMSO can, under extreme conditions, react with oxygen and convert into dimethyl sulfate, a highly toxic gas. Could this explain the chemical smell, the collapse of the hospital staff, the near nerve gas-like effects? The theory was compelling, but not entirely proven. Experts debated whether the reaction could have occurred in the human body at all. Even if it had, it still didn't explain everything. Why had only some people collapsed? Others were in the room but were unaffected. Why did her body remain toxic for so long? And most disturbingly, why had no other case like this ever been recorded in medical history? To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to Gloria Ramirez. Her case remains one of the most baffling and unsettling medical mysteries ever recorded. Her body was eventually buried, her remains still considered potentially hazardous. But the legend of the toxic lady endures. A woman who, in death, became something beyond human. A presence that no one could approach without suffering. A medical anomaly, or something far more terrifying.